This episode is interesting for the fact that it has the single best character-driven plot of the entire What If series, while at the same time having the most frustratingly stupid plot contrivances. Not to mention the fact that most of what happens in this episode is in conflict with the established rules of the MCU and shouldn't be possible. These things are far more than just surface-level discrepancies. The entire What If series is predicated on the idea that actions in one timeline will generate new timelines. All of this was explained thoroughly during the Loki series. Furthermore, the conclusion of Season 1 of the Loki series is the very reason why the What If series is even allowed to exist to begin with within the MCU. But that's just the beginning. From start to finish, this episode is packed with terrible writing and incredibly stupid plot elements, easily making it one of the worst and most frustrating episodes in the entire series. Marvel's What If is bad. Episode 4. We begin with Stephen Strange on his way to the awards banquet, but things are a little different from the movie. Here, Stephen and Christine are still in a relationship, and he goes to pick her up first. Rather than getting into an accident because he was distracted by his phone call, Stephen tries to pass a truck, but is then hit from behind by someone else. The result of this is rather than having Stephen's hands destroyed in the accident, Christine takes the brunt of the injury and perishes. The episode then takes some pretty significant shortcuts explaining what happened afterwards in the form of the narrator delivering a single line of dialogue. He says, "Grief-stricken, Strange sought answers across the world and in the mystic arts." And that's it. That's basically all we got for explanation for how he went from the accident to becoming Sorcerer Supreme. This has got to be the laziest way possible to handle this situation. In the movie, Strange was looking for new types of medical technology or surgery that could restore the use of his hands. He was never looking for the mystic arts, and even when he heard of the location Kamar-Taj, he didn't believe that it was any sort of place to get magical abilities. He believed that it was some sort of secret, kind of underground, space-age new medical tech that might be able to help him, even if it wasn't completely on the up and up, and even though it wasn't fully authorized to be used. That's what he believed it was, and when he first arrived at Kamar-Taj, when he was told about the mystic arts and that sort of thing, he just dismissed it as being nonsense. This is relevant because we have to ask, what was this episode's version of Doctor Strange actually looking for when he was traveling the world? Christine was dead. No amount of surgery or medical technology was going to bring her back from that.
It's science.
So what was he looking for in the world? What technology or innovation did he possibly think could bring Christine back to life? And remember, he didn't believe that magic and the mystic arts was even possible until he was explicitly shown it by the Ancient One. He would never go looking for it actively because he thought it was all complete nonsense. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that this episode's version of Doctor Strange would have been any different prior to actually seeing magic being used at Kamar-Taj by the Ancient One. The point I'm trying to make here is that there is no reason whatsoever for this episode's version of Stephen Strange to be searching the world for a scientific solution only to eventually end up at the mystic arts, just like the main MCU version. Stephen Strange could still become the Sorcerer Supreme in this timeline, but this method just doesn't work.
This doesn't make any sense.
The fact is that the writers on this show simply are not talented enough to think of a good reason, so instead they opted to take the laziest method possible, using a single line of dialogue from the narrator, and hoped that no one would notice.
That is one big pile of shit.
Through more narration, we learn the rest of the events from the movie also happen as they originally did, with Strange becoming the Sorcerer Supreme and defeating Dormammu. This is where the recap ends and the original What If story begins, with Doctor Strange still grieving over the loss of Christine, and now in the possession of the Time Stone. He begins considering if he should use it to change the past and save her. Wong advises him to leave the past alone, but Strange ignores it, and uses the Time Stone to travel back to the moment when he first picked up Christine on their way to the award banquet. This might look a little odd because Strange appears to be using the Time Stone to teleport to another location, but that's not exactly what's happening, and I'll explain it in a second. we need to take a quick pause to go over how the Time Stone and the Space Stone work in the MCU. Simply put, the Time Stone allows you to travel through and control time, whereas the Space Stone allows you to travel through and control space. You would think this would be a simple concept to grasp, but you underestimate just how bad the writers on this show actually are. In this case, it's handled properly, which only makes it more frustrating when the writers screw it up several times later in the episode, but in this instance, Doctor Strange isn't using the Time Stone to specifically move his location. Instead, he's using it to rewind his own life to go back to a specific time in his own life. So it makes sense that by rewinding himself, he would end up at a different location. There's some more important stuff about this particular method of time travel, and I'll cover that a little bit later. Continuing, they both get into the car, but while driving this time, Strange decides not to pass the truck, hoping to change the event, but to his surprise, the other car still hits them from behind, resulting in the accident that causes Christine to perish. Strange uses the Time Stone to go back once more, but this time decides to take a different route. However, it still results in an accident, causing Christine's demise.
The body count keeps rising, and it's harder and harder to justify it.
After this, we see a Groundhog Day-like sequence of events where Strange repeatedly goes back in time trying to save Christina through a variety of different methods, but fails each and every time. Eventually, he's met by the Ancient One, and this is where the episode begins to get extremely stupid very quickly.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
Right away, there are two things wrong with the Ancient One being here. First, she apparently used some kind of time travel to get here, even though she doesn't have possession of the Time Stone right now, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, for those that are paying attention, that kind of a portal is not a sling ring portal. We've seen many sling ring portals in the movies and in this episode. That is not one of them. She is somehow using time travel to get to this location, despite not having the Time Stone, which is just really dumb. Secondly, she somehow has information about the future that she shouldn't have access to, and that being, we were explicitly told by the Ancient One that she can't see past her own death. And yes, that is the same, and it is true for this universe as well, because we saw part of that in the earlier montage in the episode. So one, she shouldn't even be here, and two, she has information she shouldn't have access to.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
But don't worry, it gets worse. We're then introduced to one of the most idiotic, mind-numbingly stupid things to ever be added to the MCU, and given some of the garbage we've gotten in recent years, that is a very tall hill to climb. The Ancient One explains that the reason why Doctor Strange can't change this particular event is because it's known as an absolute point, meaning that this particular event is unchangeable and that no matter what, it must always happen. And let me just start by saying, that is fucking retarded.
How dumb are you?
I've mentioned previously the writers on this show don't pay attention to detail, which leads to some incredibly stupid decisions on their part, but this one is a really big fucking detail, and there's a lot to unpack here, so get comfortable. During the movie Endgame, we were given introduction to time travel in the MCU, and then during the Loki series, we were explicitly told in detail exactly how that time travel would work, and that whenever something is changed, it creates a branching alternate timeline. The main goal of the series, besides emasculating Loki, was to establish the multiverse and how time travel works. And this means that every time Doctor Strange was going back in time in order to try to save Christine, he was changing things and he should have been creating alternate timelines. However, because the writers on this show have no idea what they're doing, what gets explained in this episode by the Ancient One is the complete opposite. She tells Doctor Strange that he's stuck in a paradox and that he can't change the event with Christine because it would alter his future and that would prevent him from becoming the Sorcerer Supreme, which is both wrong and incredibly stupid.
Why don't you explain this to me like I'm 5?
In the MCU, there are two types of time travel. The first is the method used by the Quantum Realm and the TVA. This will allow a person to go to a specific time and location in a given universe. However, it is extremely important to note that the person traveling does not replace the version that is original to that timeline they just arrived at. Instead, the traveler is a temporary addition to that universe. We saw this numerous times throughout Endgame and Loki. However, Doctor Strange is not using that method. He's using the second type of time travel, travel, which employs the Time Stone. And by using the Time Stone, he is reversing himself through his own timeline, which means that he is not an extra to this universe, he is still the original. There are no other versions of Doctor Strange in this particular universe. He can't replace himself because there is no other self for him to replace. And we know for a fact that this is the case for two reasons. First, we've seen the Time Stone at work and how it will reverse objects through time, both in the movie and in this episode. And second, if he had used the other Quantum Realm TVA method, then that would have meant that a future version of Doctor Strange would have ended up appearing right next to the younger version of Doctor Strange. And certainly he could have tried to help himself, just like Marty in Back to the Future Part 2.
88 miles per hour!
But that is very obviously not what happens in this episode. It is clear that he is not jumping into alternate universes and instead is using the Time Stone to reverse his own life to a point that he wants to go to. This is extremely important to know because when the Ancient One says that he can't change the event because then he would never become the Sorcerer Supreme, that is utter nonsense. This version of Doctor Strange at that point in time already knows everything that's going to happen, and he could very easily repeat all of those steps in a similar way to ensure that he would still become the Sorcerer Supreme. And really, because he already knows everything that's going to happen, it would be a lot easier this time.
I'm writing this down. This is good stuff.
Again, I need to emphasize that the younger version of Strange that the Ancient One seems to be concerned about no longer exists. There is only the future version of Stephen Strange that is using the Time Stone to move backwards and forwards through his own lifetime. Of course, it should go without saying that Stephen Strange doing this sort of thing would create an infinite number of branching timelines, but he doesn't really seem to care about that sort of thing, and neither did the show creators, so whatever.
Time travel!
And speaking of alternate timelines, it's also important to mention that there are an infinite number of timelines, including the primary MCU timeline, where Christine does not die. So the very concept of an absolute point that is unchangeable is complete and utter garbage. An absolute point in time is simply not possible within the rules of the MCU. And I have to ask, why would Disney and Marvel spend so much time and so much money subjecting everyone to 6 episodes of that dumpster fire Loki series to establish the rules for time travel and the multiverse if you're just going to ignore them in the very next series?
Do I really look like a guy with a plan?
And since I know someone is going to bring it up, the fact that this is a different universe does not mean that time travel would work differently. And this is because the rules for time travel are controlled by the multiverse, which is on a higher tier of existence, and not by the individual universes. This was all explicitly explained in detail during the Loki series. This is how the multiverse even exists. If you have universes that only create paradoxes and don't create branching timelines, then they wouldn't be able to exist within the multiverse.
Excellent point!
Everything in this scene, from the moment the Ancient One arrives, is not just illogical, but completely contradicts all of the established rules in the MCU. And again, if you're just gonna throw the rules away whenever you find it inconvenient, then why even bother making them? And if you stop to think about it, this entire situation gets even dumber when you realize that because of the multiverse, there are an infinite number of timelines where the car would still crash, but it would have been Stephen that died instead of Christine, which means that Doctor Strange, who knew about the multiverse, could have tried to travel to one of those other timelines where Christine survived and just spent his life with her instead.
When did my job become pitching you ideas? Right!
But don't worry, it gets worse. Doctor Strange ignores the warnings of the Ancient One and decides that he still wants to try to bring Christine back, but as he's activating the Time Stone, the Ancient One attacks him with magic. And this is going to lead to a situation later on in the episode that somehow manages to be even more ridiculous than the absolute point garbage that I just went over. After being hit by the magic from the Ancient One, Doctor Strange is teleported to a large temple at an unknown location at an unknown point in time. And this makes no sense. As previously explained, the Time Stone doesn't allow you to move to another location unless you are reversing your own timeline, and that is not what is happening here. Also, the Ancient One is not capable of sending someone else to another location without the use of a sling ring. We saw this numerous times throughout the movies and even in this episode. There is no possible way within the the existing rules of the MCU for Doctor Strange to have been teleported to this location.
That's what turns me on about you. Your attention to detail.
Again, what's the point of making rules if you're just going to fucking ignore them? But what makes this situation even more ridiculous is that only seconds after arriving at the temple, Doctor Strange notices there isn't a door to get inside, so instead he just uses his sling ring to create a portal that takes him inside the temple.
You serious?
Honestly, at this point, it's difficult to tell if the writers on this show just don't know the source material or if they're selectively choosing to ignore it. Inside the temple, Doctor Strange speaks to the librarian known as Obang, which is a character that has been racistly blackwashed because fucking of course. This sort of blatantly racist change is pretty common for Disney and Marvel these days because the woke weirdos believe that it's the good kind, but this particular situation has a little extra to it. You see, there was already a black character in the Doctor Strange movie named Mordo, but for whatever reason they decided not to include that character in this episode, and by removing Mordo, that meant that this episode of What If would have been the only one to not have a single black character in it, and that simply is not allowed.
If you don't like this, you are a bigot.
But see, it's even dumber than that, because Mordo in the Doctor Strange movie was also a character that had been racistly blackwashed, which means that because they removed him from this episode of What If, they ended up replacing a racistly blackwashed token diversity quota character with another racistly blackwashed diversity quota token character. That's kinda weird. It's almost like Disney and Marvel aren't actually interested in creating quality characters, but would rather put emphasis on checking off diversity boxes.
Well, I definitely am not white.
Anyways, replacement token insert then shows Doctor Strange around the library, where he finds a book that tells him in order to break an absolute point in time, he would need enough power, and that power can be obtained by absorbing other magical beings. Strange starts opening portals to other dimensions that contain a variety of mystic creatures and then absorbing their power into himself. He uses the Time Stone to freeze his own age as he spends hundreds of years gaining tremendous amount of power from these mystical creatures. Eventually, Strange believes he has enough power, but when he goes to talk to Replacement Token Insert, he finds that Replacement Token Insert is now extremely old, and he offers to use the Time Stone to reverse this, but Replacement Token Insert doesn't want it. And as he's dying, Replacement Token Insert tells Doctor Strange that he has only been living half a life. And as if the earlier stuff in the episode wasn't dumb enough, this is the point where the episode begins to go off the rails fucking stupid.
I hate this. It is revolting.
In the next scene, we see an earlier version of Doctor Strange who chose not to go back in time to try to save Christine, but as he walks outside his building, he notices the world seems to be corrupted and is being destroyed by some unknown dark energy. A portal opens with the arrival of the Ancient One. This looks exactly like what we saw earlier in the episode, except this is not her in a physical form, but it's explained that it is a psychic impression that was sent through a splinter in reality. And I have to ask, if it's the exact same type of magic portal, then why is this one a psychic impression and the other one was actually a physical form? Wouldn't they both be psychic impressions? And never mind, the writers don't need to pay attention to detail. Also, this contradicts what we already know about her not being able to go past her own death, but whatever, it's actually even dumber than that. She explains that while Doctor Strange was traveling back in time, she cast a spell that created two timelines that exist within the same universe.
I'm sorry. What?
And I cannot begin to express how unbelievably fucking dumb that is.
All right, you primitive screwheads, listen up.
Okay, here we go. So in the setting of the MCU, the word timeline and universe are the same thing, and the words can be used interchangeably. The mistake the dumb, no-talent writers are making here is the belief that a timeline is somehow contained within the universe, which is wrong. The timeline is the universe and vice versa.
There
you get me?
So when a change happens that creates an alternate branching timeline, that is effectively another universe. So timeline and universe are the same thing. Because of this, it is not possible to have two timelines within the same universe, because effectively it's two universes within the same universe, which doesn't make any sense at all. And if you do have two universes that are attempting to combine, then that would result in all of the objects in that universe colliding with its counterpart. In fact, there was an entire series of Marvel comics about this exact thing happening. And when one universe is brought into contact with another universe, it's called an incursion, and it almost always results in the absolute destruction of both universes.
Or you couldn't be bothered to do your own basic research.
So the idea of the Ancient One creating multiple timelines, i.e. universes, to exist within one universe is just nonsensical. But don't worry, it gets worse. Stop and think about this for a second. We've seen this over the last 10 years in the MCU. In order to make a change that affects the entire universe, a person would need to have control over all 6 of the Infinity Stones. And while each one of them is individually powerful, none of them are even remotely close to being able to make a change on a universe-wide level by themselves. You need all of them. But in this situation, when the Ancient One cast her magic spell, it was only affecting a single Infinity Stone. Now, she did say that she drew power from the Dark Dimension to cast the spell, but that doesn't matter. Because first of all, the Ancient One is only able to use a very small amount of power from the Dark Dimension. But even assuming that she was able to use 100% of the Dark Dimension power, it still would not have been enough to literally create a duplicate of the entire universe.
You can smell the shit from 5 miles away.
The idea that the Ancient One could utilize just one of the Infinity Stones combined with a small amount of power from the Dark Dimension to create a complete duplicate of the entire universe. We're talking every person, every creature, every animal, every rock, every building, every planet, every star, everything in the entire universe was duplicated by her using a little bit of power from the Dark Dimension, and a single Infinity Stone is fucking absurd.
Know your fucking place, trash.
What's even dumber about this entire situation is because of how branching timelines in the multiverse were explained in the Loki series, we know that the actions of the Ancient One to try to create this alternate timeline were entirely unnecessary, because when Doctor Strange was sitting in the chair trying to decide if he should go back in time or if he should leave it as is, we know that there are an infinite number of timelines and that both of these choices were made. Because of the Loki series, we know that every time a person makes a decision, each and every one of those options becomes its own branching alternate timeline. It was the job of the TVA to go and prune the unwanted ones, but they can't do that anymore, so now all of these alternate branching timelines are being created constantly at an infinitely increasing rate. And remember, the entire What If series in this episode is only able to happen because of the events of the Loki series, which recreated the multiverse. Which means that when Doctor Strange was sitting in that chair deciding what to do, there was one timeline where he went back to try to save Christine, there was another where he decided not to, and there was another where he ordered a pizza. There was an infinite number of possibilities that were created from all of these different moments. And the point of this is that the Ancient One didn't have to try to create an alternate timeline because it was already happening naturally.
I barely have a reason to care, and even I noticed.
So this version of Doctor Strange decides that he needs to stop the other one before the entire universe melts away. And of course, this version has no idea how to find the other one, but luckily he just gets pulled through a portal and it solves that problem.
That's just lazy writing.
The two have a little chat where the demon version explains that their powers have been diluted because they were split, but I don't know why he couldn't just spend another couple hundred years absorbing more demons in order to counteract this, but whatever, I guess they just need the plot to move forward. This results in the two of them fighting, which I have to be honest, was pretty decent. I'll give them credit for that. It was definitely the best part of the episode, but that's not all that difficult to do when the rest of the episode is absolute garbage. Ultimately, the demon version wins, absorbing the other version, and then uses the time stone to undo the absolute point in time. Unfortunately for him, right now he looks very demonic, and when Christine returns, she's terrified. Also, the entire universe begins collapsing, and in just a matter of seconds, everything else besides the Earth is completely gone, which is a little weird considering there's lots of very powerful cosmic beings who apparently just didn't bother to try to stop it, and they just, let the universe get melted away, but whatever.
Give me something for the pain and let me die.
Ignoring that stupidity, Strange uses all of his powers to create a barrier protecting himself and Christine. He then notices Uatu the Watcher and begs for help. The Watcher refuses, and Strange is left trapped inside a small bubble with Christine, who begins dissolving into nothingness.
And that is the whole problem with aliens, is you just can't trust them.
There are so many things wrong with this episode. Doctor Strange making changes should have created alternate timelines, thereby making some of the actions of the Ancient One completely unnecessary. The concept of an absolute point is simply not possible as it conflicts with the established rules of the MCU and the multiverse. The idea of an absolute point is also nonsensical because there are an infinite number of other timelines where Christine is still alive. Both Doctor Strange and the Ancient One managed to teleport without the use of portals created by sling rings. The Ancient One somehow knows about the future beyond her own death, even though we were explicitly told it wasn't possible. The stupid idea of having multiple timelines existing within the same universe, which makes no sense, because in the MCU, a timeline and a universe are the same thing. The Ancient One simply does not have the power to create a duplicate universe. I don't care how much energy she draws from the Dark Dimension, that is just absurd. But the single most monumentally stupid thing about this entire episode is the fact that Doctor Strange is well aware of the existence of the Infinity Stones and what they're capable of. After all, he uses one of them on a regular basis. And because of that information, he would know about the Reality Stone and what it's capable of, meaning that he should have been trying to track down the Reality Stone, which would have resolved his problem far more easily and simply by just using the Reality Stone to change the rules surrounding Christine's death, thereby eliminating the absolute point from existence entirely. But of course, that would require the writers to actually understand the source material. And that's the end of episode 4.